Chapter 2. Thought Collectives, Misreadings of Theories, and Epistemic Exclusion. The Case for Open Theory.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
George Bernard Shaw. SLA is composed of divergent theories, which have given rise to different academic communities and scientific traditions. One of the most relevant efforts to compile knowledge about such theories in recent years is Van Patten et al. 2020, currently in its third edition. In this volume entitled Theories in Second Language Acquisition, an introduction, leading scholars in some of the most influential theoretical frameworks in SLA, widely followed by researchers and practitioners around the world, contributed one chapter per theory. These chapters provide concise explanations about the foundations and terminology of each theory, as well as a representative study. Notably, one of the sections in all chapters is entitled What Counts as Evidence, which highlights the fact that evidence production is dependent on a given theory, as discussed in the previous section. The theories contained in this volume are Linguistic Theory, Universal Grammar, and Second Language Acquisition, contributed by Lydia White. 2. The Concept-Oriented Approach to L2 Acquisition, contributed by Kathleen Bardovi-Harlig. 3. Usage-Based Approaches to L2 Acquisition, contributed by Nick Ellis and Stephanie Wolfe. Skill Acquisition Theory, contributed by Robert de Keyser. Input Processing in Adult L Acquisition, contributed by Bill Van Patten. The Declarative Procedural Model, a neurobiologically motivated theory of first and second language, contributed by Michael Ullman. Processability Theory, contributed by Manfred Pieneman and Danke Lenzing. Input, Interaction, and Output in L Acquisition, contributed by Susan Gass and Alison Mackey. Sociocultural Theory and L Development, contributed by James Lantolf, Matthew Poner, and Stephen Thorne. And 10. Complex Dynamic Systems Theory, contributed by Diane Larson Freeman. Some of these contributions refer to theories, but others to models, approaches, or meta-theories. Some of them are indeed competing theories, while some of them are more compatible. Their scope also varies, with some being neurological, others cognitive, and others more socio-cognitive. A couple of very relevant contemporary SLA theories that are not contained in the volume mentioned above include Jan Holstein's BLC-HLC theory of proficiency, Holstein B, as well as the modular cognition framework by John Truscott and Michiel Sharwood-Smith, e.g. Truscott-Amp, Sharwood-Smith. My perspective is that keeping track not only of these theories, but also the people who are associated with them, as well as the context of their emergence, will be important for the subsequent discussions. This is because sociological understandings of scientific disagreement, such as the ones that inform this analytical review, require us to keep track of who says what and why. In a way, these theories and these communities are the subjects of my inquiry, instead of the field of SLA, partly because such field does not exist beyond researchers and theorists, but rather is comprised by them. A more traditional view of the philosophy of science is one which assumes that scientific inquiry should transcend any individual, that theories should be observed in their own right. However, just like SLA, the philosophy of science had its own social turn, and has thus seen important changes, debates, and 5 developments resulting from the incorporation of sociological understandings of science-making. As Oreskes 2021 narrates in her historiographical account,
whether one had read Comte or Ayer or Popper, one could have come away with the impression that scientists, like Descartes in his room staring at melting wax, lived, worked, and thought alone. Yet anyone who studied science in action, as Comte instructed us to do, or who participated in scientific research knew that wasn't so. Yet somehow this had escaped sustained scholarly attention. Ludwig Fleck changed that. Fleck shifted attention from the individual scientist to the activities of communities of scientists, and proposed that scientific facts are the collective accomplishment of communities. In doing so, he pioneered the analysis of the social interactions that yield scientific facts.
p. 29. There are many scholars who have expanded on this social take on the philosophy of science, where one of the most notable works is Science as Social Knowledge by Helen Longino 1990, a book in which the author defends the value of science as a social activity. The expansion continues, to the degree that in the contemporary literature we can find all kinds of related topics, from how oil companies influence science by creating false scientific disagreement, Oreskes and Conway 2011, to the role of stubbornness in science, Santana 2021. Applied linguistics has not escaped these kinds of observations, with Young 2018, analyzing the field through Ludwig Fleck's concept of thought collectives. Thought collectives are groups of academics who interact with each other with shared assumptions. We can of course think of SLA theories, theorists and their subscribers as such groups, which allows for a more multi-layered analysis. However, I believe incorporating both technical and sociological issues when investigating theories and consensus building entails 2 risks. The first one is focusing so much on the systemic and social issues that consequently a rigorous technical understanding of theories and their actual incompatibility is lost. The second one is the opposite, focusing so much on the presupposed inherent technical nature of theories, that the context of their emergence and how systemic and social factors mediate their incompatibility gets lost. Here, I attempt to strike a balance.
The limits of specialization.
I would like to start by encouraging some personal reflection by the reader. Whether a novice or an experienced researcher, do I know how the field is structured? Do I know all of the theories mentioned above? Do I know their basic tenets and terminology? Does knowing and understanding SLA's theoretical landscape constitute great expertise, or should we consider it very basic, even starting knowledge? From my perspective, understanding SLA theories both constitutes great expertise, in reality, and it should be considered very basic knowledge, ideally. This distance between what is in fact difficult, and what should quite clearly be a normal standard of basic knowledge, is perhaps created by the status quo of academia, where we value specialization over more panoramic or big-picture knowledge. But master of one trade, jack of only one trade. Academics from other fields have shared similar concerns. To mention one example which I consider captures the problem in a concise and effective way, Casadevall and Fang 2014 wrote in the Journal of Infection and Immunology.
The advantages of specialization of science include efficiency, the establishment of normative standards, and the potential for greater rigor in experimental research. However, specialization also carries risks of monopoly, monotony, and isolation.
p. 1355. We may also need to engage in these types of reflections, the first of which could be the way we receive and provide training in applied linguistics and SLA, because it is often the case that depending on the university of our choice, we will receive training in one of many theories within the context of its corresponding thought collective, and can we really contribute to SLA globally if we only gain depth in a single theoretical framework? I would argue that even if we could, the efforts will be limited. While contributing to one theory, we might also be contributing to the theoretical fragmentation of the field. Having expressed such a view, I would like to clarify that my use of the word fragmentation is not only rhetorical, but we can quite literally see it in graphical representations of bibliometric analyses, such as the one carried out by Zhang 2020. When CO citations are statistically analyzed, we find clusters that reflect associations between researchers of similar theoretical orientations, which sheds light into how SLA is structured as a field. In short, there are indications of many types that point towards separated thought collectives, which do not engage too much with each other. In my view, separation is a key word, and a consequential one, as training in one theory clearly reduces our chances and perhaps even our disposition to understand and engage with a different theory. The next question, then, is whether this separation does actually limit graduate students' and researchers' panoramic understanding of the field. I argue that not only is this the case, but there are many signs that even a very basic understanding of major theories is not an easy goal to achieve. In fact, another notable section of each chapter in Van Patten et al. 2020 is dedicated to common misunderstandings, which gave SLA theorists the opportunity to clarify erroneous, yet commonly held notions about their theories. But even without such a section in such a book, anyone delving into SLA literature will notice exchanges and clarifications among top researchers and theorists. There have been some studies where researchers from a certain paradigm try to replicate studies or attempt to challenge rival theories, or components of the theories, all common and needed procedures in science making. But the responses and subsequent discussions usually do not focus on the empirical evidence that has been found, but on whether the rival theory is being properly characterized or operationalized in the first place. One example of this could be Zhang and Lantolf 2015. A study conducted by people associated with sociocultural theory (CT) that attempted to challenge the teachability hypothesis, which is associated with processability theory (PT), developed by Manfred Pieneman. Following this publication, there was a response by Pieneman 2015, where he stated that the teachability hypothesis was being mischaracterized as a corollary to PT, when in fact this hypothesis predated PT, and that the methodology employed by Zhang and Lantolf was not appropriate to observe the phenomenon in question. There was then a subsequent response by Lantolf and Zhang 2015, where they admitted to the first criticism, but insisted that their method for gathering data was valid, and provided their rationale for their methodology, as well as evidence to support it. In a homologous case, D. Kaiser and Sokalski 1996 attempted to replicate two experiments from the theory of processing instruction, PI, namely Van Patten and Cadierno 1993A and 1993B. De Keyser and Sokalski argued they could not replicate the findings of the original experiments, claiming that their theory of skill acquisition more accurately explained their results. However, it seems that De Keyser and Sokalski employed both terminology and methodology from their own theoretical framework in trying to replicate a study from a different theory. This was pointed out by Van Patten in a more recent article.
De Keyser and Sokalski, Set up a research design that indeed compares comprehension practice versus production practice that obtains different results from those reported by Van Patten and Cadierno, and many other publications after them. The problem here is the misreading of Van Patten and Cadierno's claims, and the subsequent research design that is not a replication of any kind of processing instruction.
Van Patten, 2015, p. 99, emphasis added. Van Patten also added that in his view, it is difficult to see how De Keyser and Sokalski would view PI as something in direct opposition to their preferred framework, skill theory. Indeed, one could actually view them as complementary. Van Patten, 2015, p. 100. In the previous two examples of interactions between top SLA theorists, we can appreciate that even for them, it is hard to agree on the particulars of rival theories, and the ways in which they can or should be operationalized into valid methodologies. It goes without saying that if we do not have a valid methodology, we do not have a study. Presumably as a consequence, theorists very commonly engage in theory clarification efforts and, in order to make this claim substantive and convincing, I show a few detailed examples below.
Let's clarify. Theorists against misconceptions.
We could begin with sociocultural theories, CT. James Lantolf has repeatedly clarified the scope and intention of SCT, for example Lantolf, 2006b, which is commonly mistaken for a theory that stresses the importance of social interaction, when in fact what it offers is a sophisticated view of language and learning based on the work of Lev Vygotsky, 1896-1934. SCT is not an SLA theory, but rather a general theory of psychology that has been extended into SLA. A theory that can take on deep philosophical issues. Would humans be capable of, for example, free will without language or without culture? To what degree can a modern human's cognitive abilities and structure of the brain be the way they are without culture? While there has traditionally been a perceived tension between cognitive and social approaches to SLA, see Hulstein et al., 2014, for SCT culture is as cognitively mediated, as cognition is culturally mediated. Brain and culture are deeply intertwined in a dialectical or back-and-forth type of interaction across time, a relationship which creates the mind and allows for its development. In commenting how Vygotskian psychology is received in academia, James Lantolf stated that
many people have not read Vygotsky's writings extensively or intensively, and they often misinterpret his approach, which is dialectical, historical, and materialist. It is something that those educated in other traditions fail to appreciate, which results in their misinterpretation.
James Lantolf, Personal Communication, March 23, 2023, emphasis added. A specific example of this is a recent paper by Lantolf and Shi 2023, which reviewed literature about digital language learning research that used SCT as a theoretical framework. In it, the authors seemed dissatisfied with applications of the theory.
Peterson P. sees SCT as a theory that supports social interaction as the primary driver of learning, and considers a major feature of the theory to be mediation as scaffolding P, a viewpoint that is also supported by Zhao and Lai. If the preceding characterizations of the theory were accurate, it would render the theory banal and uninteresting.
Lantolf and Shi, 2023, p. 703. Likewise, complexity theorists also engage in constant clarifications about the difference between complex and complicated. For example, Larson-Freeman, 2006, 2016, Hiver, and Al-Houri, 2019, about the very common misconstrual that complex dynamic systems theory CDST was born in the physical sciences, for example, Larson-Freeman, 2020. And after extensive work reviewing CDST studies, they also warn of methodologies that do not capture the essence of the theory, as well as the need to guard against opportunistic uses of CDST. Hiver and Al-Houri, 2019, Hiver et al., 2022. Furthermore, a common misconception of CDST is that it is a quantitative research pursuit, and while innovative statistical methods have been indeed introduced for this theoretical framework, for example, Verspor et al., 2011, what it offers is far from a quantitative approach, and more of an ontological position. Everything is deeply multivariate and everything changes over time. Ivor et al., 2022. It is true that CDST theorists are interested in systems, a word which is commonly associated with, for example, weather prediction, or with the analysis of large sets of numerical data. However, they also warn against uncritically incorporating these quantitative methodologies into the social sciences, Hiver and Al-Houri, 2019, p. 40, and even encourage the use of qualitative methods to engage in causal analysis. The main idea here is that in CDST the more traditional concerns about the pros and cons of quantitative versus qualitative designs are replaced by the pros and cons of small versus large populations, and short versus long timescales. Hiver et al., 2022, p. 917. In fact, the size of a system in CDST can be as small as the coupling of one single L2 learner, with all of her personal variables throughout time. As Phil Hiver states,
Some scholars propose that CDST is a science of the individual, meaning that the system we should be studying is the N of one person in context that is of interest to us, because they are where we can see the outcomes and processes we are looking for. This, however, brings up the ergodicity problem written about by, for example, Lowy and Verspor 2019, in which we cannot assume that results and observations at the individual level are valid for making sense of group-level phenomena, or vice versa.
Phil Hiver, Personal Communication, September 8, 2023. Along the same lines, Michael Ullman has also made important clarifications about his proposed neurologically informed DP model for first and second language acquisition, namely, that the declarative and procedural memory systems, which are neurological systems, do not have a one-to-one correspondence with the explicit versus implicit memory model traditionally employed in SLA, a psychological model. This conflation is apparent in some SLA literature, with Rod Ellis stating in his monograph that in cognitive SLA, there seems to be a consensus that there are two linguistic systems in the mind. One would be an explicit declarative system, while the other is an implicit procedural system, Ellis 2015 p. 219, and with Lourdes Ortega utilizing the same dichotomy in her own monograph Ortega 2014 p. 87. But while indeed procedural memory is only implicit, Ullman has clarified that the declarative memory system cannot exclusively be associated with explicit memory, but is also one of the systems that subserve implicit knowledge, Ullman et al., 2020, p. 395. In a recent Q&A session, Ullman stated,
Historically, declarative memory, even the name declarative memory, was strongly and even uniquely associated with explicit knowledge or knowledge that can be brought to awareness. And so even today, even researchers in cognitive neuroscience, less than before, but it's still true, they may talk about declarative memory as memory underlying explicit knowledge. This has been problematic for more than 20 years.
Ullman, 2020a, 1 2024. Robert D. Kaiser seconds this clarification. Procedural is not exactly the opposite of declarative. D. Kaiser 2017, p. 16. In my opinion, skill-building theory by Robert D. Kaiser suffers from one of the greatest misunderstandings in the field when it comes to its claims about declarative and procedural memory. Because the literal claim most associated with De Kaiser is that proceduralization is the process of turning declarative knowledge into procedural knowledge. De Kaiser 2020b p. 84. SLA authors may dismiss this position based on certain misreadings and through ambiguous terminology such as strong, weak, and no interface, terms that aim to capture disagreement in the field. When it comes to explicit and implicit knowledge, as De Kaiser points out,
the non-interface point of view is perhaps most strongly associated with Krashen, and endorsed by a number of researchers, e.g. Truscott. The non-interface position, however, seems based on an overly radical interpretation of interface, and tied to the somewhat misleading wording about declarative knowledge getting converted or transformed into procedural knowledge. This terminology may be seen as implying that the more procedural knowledge there is on a given point, the less declarative knowledge there is, which often is not true, De Kaiser, nor is it the case that declarative knowledge somehow moves from the parts of the brain where declarative knowledge seems to be stored, that is, the hippocampus and the temporal cortex, to the areas where procedural knowledge is stored, that is, the basal ganglia and the frontal cortex. Henke, Ullman. What does seem to be the case, however, and this is crucial, is that declarative knowledge allows learners to engage in the target behavior, e.g., using a morphosyntactic rule in communication, and by drawing on this declarative knowledge repeatedly to engage in this behavior repeatedly, forming procedural knowledge, establishing a habit after some repetition, and then gradually automatizing this habit, and perhaps eventually, for some structures in some people, implicit knowledge.
De Kaiser, 2017, p. 19. This view that one memory system allows for behaviors that aid development in the other system has been theorized by several researchers throughout the years. Holstein, 2001, p. 210, Paradis, 2009, p. 87, Ullman, 2020a, 135. Manfred Pienemann's processability theory, PT, is also prone to mischaracterizations since it takes on L2 development, a topic that is also associated with generative approaches to SLA. PT proposes a six-stage universal processing hierarchy, which has nothing to do with the more commonly known Chomskyan universal grammar. See Holstein 2015a. PT deals with developmental stages, not in direct relation to grammatical accuracy, but in relation to predictable increases in complexity of processing prerequisites. Pienemann, 2015. p. 142. And while the use of the word universal may be strong, the theory accounts for variation in each stage, and not as non-native grammatical mistakes, but as alternative manifestations of an underlying system. p. 142. In 2015 there was a special issue about L2 development in language learning, where these theoretical clarifications by Pienemann, and other SLA authors, were compiled and contrasted by Jan Hulstein, 2015a. Through direct communication with these scholars, Hulstein was able to reach a level of dialogue and depth that is difficult to achieve from published works alone. Of course, if theories are the products of theorists, going to the original source is the best strategy for clarification. It is also interesting to note, when it comes to the above paragraph, that when talking about the same theory, Hulstein focused on the need to clarify PT is not based on Chomskyan linguistics, while Pieneman dedicated his own article to clarify terminological discrepancies in the way the words acquisition, development and variation are used in PT, compared to dynamic systems theory. This shows different authors perceive the need to clarify different misconceptions about the theories. What remains a constant, though, is the clear need to make and seek such clarifications when learning or engaging in any way with SLA theories, in light of seemingly generalized misconceptions.
Towards open theory, theoretical development as social action.
From my perspective, the issues described above cannot be merely reduced to theoretical clashing. I believe that misreadings and miscommunications are fundamentally sociological problems, where our focus should be on how theories are created, shaped, communicated, and implemented. I would argue that a state of affairs where understanding theories is a convoluted process necessitates a great deal of reflection. A question that seems simple enough, but indeed is a multi-layered issue. Should some of these clarifications not be basic knowledge about the theories? It takes a long time to read about the theories, misunderstand them, read the clarifications, reread, and reinterpret the principles of the theories time after time, for every theory. But once you start this process, some of these clarifications seem quite elementary or foundational, not to mention necessary for any attempts to challenge, falsify, replicate, or even talk about the theory in question. I believe we should also reflect, can theories really stand on their own, or do they depend on their creators to survive? Because, while we do not need Darwin or any individual theorist for evolutionary theory to survive and grow, much of what goes into keeping any SLA theory alive seems to be about clarification efforts. Also, is a theory whatever its creator says the theory is? Where can we draw the line between theory and theorist? After all, some of the clarifications above seem to be both theory-contained and empirical, like Ullmann's comment about the declarative system, while others resemble more individual assessments perhaps more open for discussion, like Pieneman's methodological objection for Zhang and Lantov, or Van Patten's statement that skill acquisition theory is compatible with processing instruction, which leads us to this. If SLA theories are created in a sort of academic isolation, only exist in certain circles around the original proponents, and get misconstrued all the time by people outside of those circles, should we not explore new ways of creating them, sharing, communicating them, as well as new avenues to debate them, and means to put them to test? Since the issue seems not to only be epistemic in a theoretical way, but also in a systemic way, I believe the appropriate solution is more social action. When it comes to the sharing issue, we could consider the open science movement, which precisely has the intention of working towards a more inclusive, connected and worldwide academia. However, most of these efforts seem to focus on access to research and transparency in quantitative studies, for example, Gass et al. 2021, Al-Hori and Hiver, 2024. Al-Hori and Hiver 2024 clarify for us that open science is much more than simply open access to journals. Instead, they provide a more comprehensive list.
Open methods, open data, materials and code, openness to replication and pre-registration, open evaluation of research rigor, and incentives to engage in all of these practices.
P23. The case I make here is that, based on the specific needs of the field of SLA, it may be time to include open theory in those efforts. That is, accessible knowledge of theories for graduate students and researchers around the world looking to gain an unbiased understanding of SLA's general theoretical landscape, especially given the centrality of theories in science-making. Additionally, because of how theories are created and debated, in relative isolation and exclusion, I believe theory development and theory evaluation should occur in the context of open theory, with dedicated open access platforms to achieve so, as well as more periodic efforts to establish communication between scholars, such as yearly forums for the sole purpose of epistemic coordination. We live in a world of technology where travel is no longer needed, not for all purposes. We have immense multimodal platforms such as YouTube, where more and more academia finds a comfortable second home. In short, we have all the tools we need to achieve low-cost communication and coordination to prevent theories from becoming academic bubbles. The issue seems particularly important in light that there are examples of many top SLA scholars, either indicting each other for not properly characterizing rival theories, or feeling a constant need to explicitly clarify very elementary information about their own proposed theories in public forums. Additionally, as clearly demonstrated in Hulstein 2015a, depth of knowledge about theories is facilitated by dialogue. We need this ongoing dialogue as additional support, Because we all have deep reasons to believe what we believe, which complicate the process of navigating the literature of opposing frameworks by other people who have other good reasons to believe what they believe.
Epistemic exclusion in theoretical development.
But because of the sociological view of science I am adopting, I feel I cannot stop here. I argue the idea of lack of access to theories needs close inspection through a social justice lens. As well, can people who do not speak or read English learn about SLA theories? Can they contribute to them, scrutinize them based on their worldviews and knowledge of their own contexts, try to falsify them or create new ones? I believe an article by Margaret Thomas may help us elucidate the significance of this question. Thomas, 1998, argued SLA authors had a tendency to portray the field as starting in the Western language science tradition in the 1960s or 1970s, in a sort of programmatic ahistoricity, as if no one had ever theorized language acquisition before that time period. Even recent historical surveys are framed this way, for example, Van Patten, et al., 2020, Ellis, 2021. She further stressed there is a conflation of particular theories and methods with the overall quest for knowledge about L2. Acquisition.
No one imagines that humans approach the phenomenon of second language learning armed with chi-square tests, think-aloud tasks, or constructs like type stimuli, or indirect negative evidence, until very recently. But are these items really what constitutes L-acquisition theory? Would the study of L-acquisition have no existence without them? This definition seems hopelessly narrow, and it mistakes the present technology of the field for its content. In doing so, it obscures the whole question of the actual history of L-acquisition theory.
Thomas, 1998, p. 391. In a response article, Gass et al. 1998 stated it was fair to argue that the field as it was then practiced originated around those decades, but that this should not
imply that we are unaware of our past or that we do not appreciate the intellectual thought of earlier times. It only implies that the past does not impact the issues of today, and that the discipline, as it is currently defined, does not have a systematic and relevant body of knowledge prior to a particular point in time.
Gass et al., 1998, p. 409. Perhaps we should put the historical argument aside for a moment, because I believe Thomas's point about mistaking science-making practices with the content of the field has deeper implications. First, I would argue that what Gass et al. Call the current, relevant body of knowledge and the issues of today was unwittingly filtered through the lens of the Anglosphere. As others have criticized, it is still the case for applied linguistics a quarter of a century later, Piller et al. 2022. The wider implication then is that science is always situated historically and socially, see Young 2018, and that the borders we set between what can and cannot be canonized are open to bias. All the works that cannot be translated into English, become popular or influential in big journals, will not become SLA knowledge, and this is, of course, socially unjust. So the programmatic biases that create an artificial demarcation of the field are not only historical, but also geographical, linguistic, cultural, and at least de facto racial. Of course, we cannot dismiss the English canon Sala. After all, this is what de facto has become more internationalized and worked on around the world. The problem is the underlying assumption that science can operate just fine, even when it clearly excludes many people. If one is not proficient in English, one cannot really learn much at all about SLA, and consequently cannot participate in theoretical development. The reason I know that is because I have experienced similar limitations firsthand. My undergraduate training in psycholinguistics to become a language teacher in Mexico only included knowledge about foundational concepts, from Noam Chomsky and Stephen Krashen, which are important to understand the origins of the current canon's theories, but not something that could be considered representative of the latest state of knowledge about acquisition, where theoretical disagreement became the main feature. I have also noticed many Mexican linguists do not know there is such a field called SLA. Perhaps partly because linguistics and literature are unique in Spanish-speaking academia, in that they do not require very proficient knowledge of English to access an international web of knowledge, since, of course, Spanish works about Spanish are extremely robust and sophisticated in their own right. Whatever the reason, though, the problem remains that the linguistic barrier prevents participation in the field. Similarly, after attending the yearly symposium of the Mexican Association of Japanese Teachers for 3 years in a row, a serious, medium-sized international event, it was clear to me that although the term second language acquisition, Daini Gengo Shutoku, was used, some basic SLA issues such as the general notion of implicit learning were not really discussed, and when I tried to discuss them, they were not really prominently known. Most Japanese teachers in this context are monolingual, or bilingual through some proficiency in Spanish. I ultimately wondered how much access they could have to SLA when all introductory courses are long, expensive books in English, and all influential research is published in English. How could we have these conversations without the possibility of a mutual ground of expertise in SLA? I concluded it would be almost impossible, and in hindsight I now wonder if it was fair to expect to have those conversations in Anglophone SLA terms at all, or whether I should have valued their efforts in their own terms. I invite the reader to consider this as only one testimony from outside the Anglosphere, and to try to think of the potential implications. Mexico and Japan are big, academically productive nations. What would it take to include these and other countries into the conversation to have truly international theoretical development? Now, of course, SLA research is carried out all around the world. However, all major theories and frameworks which are internationally followed have mostly been proposed or introduced to the field by people who either are from the United States or worked there. Again, not a diverse group of people, who although commonly engages in discussions or claims about what needs to be tackled and explained about L2 acquisition and development, may very likely lack the diversity of worldviews to do so. As Ortega 2019 exemplifies when discussing how acquisition is normally viewed in the field,
learning across non-elite conditions is so unfamiliar that it is perceived as marked and unusual, and elite multilingual learning is elevated to the default.
p34. Of course, historical and geopolitical processes have led to this situation. These are not intentional, but rather emergent circumstances. But one can both understand the tough reality and appreciate the urgency to increase epistemic diversity at the same time. We can be more intentional to balance out the obvious inequities of epistemic exclusion. Accordingly, I argue that recognizing the need for the democratization of theories as a matter of scientific integrity is a requisite for theoretical development. Devising new ways to create, communicate, and share theories through more international efforts will be a crucial step for consensus building. We need open theory, because theories cannot be operationalized, challenged, tested, modified, confirmed, falsified, or valued in any meaningful way if they belong to a social niche.
Summary of propositions in Chapter 2.
There are various theories in SLA. A very relevant example of SLA's theoretical spectrum is Van Patten and others 2020, a collaboration of prominent theorists. Some of these frameworks are theories, while others are approaches, models, or meta-theories. Some of these are competing frameworks, while others are more compatible in nature. Understanding SLA theories constitutes great expertise, but it should ideally be considered basic knowledge. Theorists engage in constant clarification efforts. Misreadings of theories are common amongst graduate students, researchers, and even top theorists. Theories belong to certain social groups, which creates a problem of access to knowledge and contribution to the field for people outside of such groups. There is a need to recognize the field as artificially demarcated. The demarcation is historical, geographical, linguistic, and racial. We can both recognize the tough reality and be intentional in solving it at the same time. Open theory should be part of the open access movement. Democratizing and internationalizing theories through easy access for everyone is a crucial step for consensus building, because consensus is partially dependent on modification, confirmation, and falsification efforts, which can only be enabled in any meaningful way when theories can be known, understood, and used by broad audiences. Ultimately, understanding theories is difficult, not only because of the technical nature of science, but because of a whole host of socio-historical factors that influence this process.